Hello, my name's Lee Thurburn, and several months ago, I was very much interested in the ongoing debate about whether or not the Ten Commandments should be taught in schools. And I began thinking about the concept of teaching the Ten Commandments in schools and why that I thought, and still do think, would have been a good idea. But it occurred to me that there's a lot of people that I think have a weak understanding of Western civilization and how it developed. My basic thought regarding the Ten Commandments being taught in schools is that it's a fundamental ethical and moral sort of foundational set of concepts that underlie all of Western civilization. And then I got to thinking about Western civilization and how it formed, and I thought it would be interesting for me, and then I thought it would be interesting to share. It'd be interesting for me to go back and do sort of a review of the critical Western history sort of components of from a historical perspective. So I decided to create what I would call a brief history, a set of PowerPoints that show graphically the foundation of Western civilization, and all the way from the earliest days up through the current time. So with that in mind, I've tried to put together a very rapid, brief history of Western civilization. To understand Western civilization, I think it's important to first kind of consider the major epochs or periods of Western civilization. The first period would be starting around 3,000 years before the advent of Christ. And there are three main groups of peoples that were present and primarily influential during this earliest time frame. They're the Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Hebrew people, the precursors of the land of Israel. And this is the period of 3000 to 500 before the Christian era. Then you have ancient Greece and ancient Rome, which bring us up to the more modern times that starts with the collapse of Rome, and then the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, the Late Middle Ages, and then the modern era that starts with the Renaissance. So let's go through a sort of a quick recap of each of these. The Mesopotamian period is 3,000 to 5,000 years before the Christian era. And the main thing that is from an influential perspective about the Mesopotamian period, which is the yellow land that you see highlighted on the geographic map there, is the implementation of written language, cuneiform. That's really, from a contributory perspective, the main thing that the Mesopotamian era and peoples were responsible for contributing. Now, as I go through this, I know that there are going to be plenty of people that will say, oh, but there was this and there was that. The thing about history is you can never quit studying it. You can always take a side path and drill down in. So I'm just going to try to hit the highlights of each civilization. Egypt was around essentially the same time, around 3,000 to 500 before the Christian era. And Egypt is important in a number of respects, mostly in its interaction with the Hebrew people. And so Egypt was a civilization, the dominant civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean during this same time frame of 3,000 to 500 before the Christian era. Then you have the Hebrew people, which really they came out of this area primarily out of the Mesopotamian era or area, and they began to really form up as a people when Abraham, around 1800 years before Christ, left the land of Ur and began to establish the foundational records for Israel. The major sort of eras of the Hebrew people are the age of judges, and which the leaders were judges. They basically ruled. And then you had, well, before that you had the age of the patriarchs, Moses and Joshua and the founding fathers, if you will, of the Egyptian people. Then you have the age of judges and the age of the kings. The kings, the first group of kings were Saul and David and Solomon, and then there were a whole series of others. Then Israel falls into two different kingdoms, eventually falls to the Assyrians, goes into Babylonian captivity, and then Jerusalem is taken over by Nebuchadnezzar's army. These are all pretty solidly documented from historical artifacts, archaeological digs, and so forth, as being irrefutably accurate renditions of the earliest period of the the Hebrew people. Now, from a contributory perspective, the main things that the Hebrew people contributed was first a monotheistic theology, believing that there is only one God, and as opposed to what was the precursor belief that there were multiple gods, that each god had a dominion over the sea or the land or the air and so forth. There are lots of different gods. Well, the Hebrews, brought the concept of a single God. They were the first believer in a single God. They brought an ethical code founded on the Ten Commandments that set really the foundational moral laws for human interactions. And they also brought a concept of social justice, where it's the responsibility of society to take care of those that are disadvantaged in some way, shape, or form. They also brought the concept of a nation having a covenant with God, and they had writing, and they brought the concept of laws that are written down for future reference as foundational sort of ideological and civilizational concepts that they brought to humanity. Next, we have ancient Greece. Ancient Greece was really in its strength through about 1200 to 200 BC. There were a lot of things that the Greek people brought to the table, and the main things were the concept of democracy, philosophical inquiry based upon reason, the pursuit of knowledge through critical thinking, artistic expression, the concept of a citizen as an individual that had responsibilities to civilization, the Olympic Games, and of course the great philosophers of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, which lay the foundation for much of Western thought. Then we have ancient Rome, which overlaps, which many of these civilizations do, which ancient Rome overlaps ancient Greece, but lasted till a later point in time. The important things here are really to think about the period of Rome from right before the Christian era, when the Roman Empire really had fully evolved. And the things that Rome brought are the concept of law and justice. The Roman legal system is really the foundational legal sort of principles that govern almost all Western legal systems. The concept of civic duty, that citizens actually actively participate in and have a special place in the life of a nation. The concepts of engineering and responsibilities of the political system, government to provide infrastructure, architectural principles, concepts of public speaking and oratory, as well as they developed were the foundation of the Latin languages, that Spanish really is a follow-on evolutionary development. The Roman Empire was really the place under which Christianity developed. And by the end of the first century, there were approximately 3,500 Christians. The largest concentrations of those, by the little yellow dots, were in the areas of Palestine, Judea, and Galilee. In the next 100 years, Christians had grown from maybe 1,000 to around 7,000, best estimates. They had spread through the northern part of the Mediterranean area along the coast. In the next 100 years, Christianity had really grown so that by the end of the 4th century, there were somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 million Christians. And as you can see by the yellow circles, they continued to sort of build out their numbers in the eastern and northern Mediterranean area. By the end of the 5th century, which would be 400 AD, there were probably about 10 million Christians, and again, still growing their numbers in those regions. During the beginning of the Dark Ages, the beginning of the 5th century, this was really the point in time when Rome had collapsed. The Roman Empire had collapsed. And as the Roman Empire had expanded, Christianity had expanded along with it, because Christianity became the de facto religion of the Roman Empire. Then you had, continuing into the Dark Ages, the continuing expansion of Christians and the development of a new group in the Persian area, the Muslims. You had Muhammad developing the Islamic faith in that area, which rapidly expanded. We have I'll do another video which talks about how and why Islam expanded like it did and so rapidly. But as we get into the middle of the Dark Ages period, you have 30 to 40 million Christians throughout the Mediterranean and European area. But Muslims are growing rapidly, and as you see in the next 100 years, they continue their expansion in northern Africa, southern Spain, and around the Mediterranean basin in the western or the eastern part of that. Now you begin to have significant conflict towards the end of the Dark Ages. You have Muslims numbering in the tens of millions, and Christians, 40 million plus Christians. And you're beginning to see a lot of conflict between these two religious groups and political groups. At the end of the Dark Ages, around the year 1000 AD, you have a lot of interaction between these two groups, and the friction is increasing, and this is going to bring us to the Middle Ages. Now, the Middle Ages is when you saw the great Crusades. The first crusade was in the end of the 11th century, 1095. Then during the 12th century, 1147 and 1189, you have the second and third crusades. And this was really primarily there were a lot of factors going on, but this is really probably primarily a religious battle based upon the desire to protect Christians as they traveled to their holy land of Jerusalem. And so there was a lot of conflict, and as a result of this conflict, the Christian nations were able to, from a military perspective, overwhelm the Islamic groups and essentially reduce their influence in the Mediterranean, and southern European areas. Now, Islam, of course, never went away. It's maintained a strong position in Persia, where it was founded, and but essentially at that point in time, the Crusades had removed the growing influence of Islam in the European area. Now, by the time we get to the 1300s, I don't have the maps now, or the circles for the different Christian and Islamic regions. We all pretty much know where those are. But during the Middle Ages, we had a number of things going on. A lot of battles, a lot of establishments. But basically, what happened fundamentally is that during the Middle Ages, late part of the Dark Ages, and in the Middle Ages, you had the feudal system develop, and also had the Black Death arrive. The Black Death wiped out close to 1/3 of the population of Europe. And in the Middle Ages, we're in 1400, you had the basically the rebirth of civilization was beginning to happen. You had the 100 Years' War, the Renaissance, the fall of Constantinople, You had the big families, the Medici family, the rise of the Ottoman Empire, the Spanish Inquisition, the War of the Roses. Interesting note, the main reason for the Spanish Inquisition was to purge Spain of Muslims and essentially force them to recant their Muslim faith and express a Christian faith. Otherwise, they basically would be put to death. So that's kind of one of the main things that the Spanish Inquisition was responsible for. During the 1500s, you have the continuing Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, Italian Wars, Spanish Inquisition is continuing. You have the beginning of the Age of Exploration. You have some wars of religion in France and peasant uprisings. Notably, the printing press is developed. There begin to be national monarchies, so the development of nations that are headed by kings and monarchs begins. During the 1600s, you have religious conflict continues. There's turmoil in England. There's a lot of scientific advancements. You have the start of a 30 Years' War in the early 1600s, the reign of King James. In the mid 1600s, you have English Civil War continues. Then there's the execution of Charles I, the rule of Oliver Cromwell. In the late 1600s, you have the restoration of the English monarchy with Charles II. And then, of course, ongoing, conflict and revolutions. By the time we get to the 1700s, we're beginning to get into the modern European era. And key points here are the War of Spanish Succession, Prussia's rise and expansion, the period of Enlightenment, which follows the French Revolution. Then there's the Great Northern War, the 7 Years' War. During this time frame, America revolts and becomes its own nation. You have Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars, continuing turmoil. Now, the 1800s is where the rise of industrialism and imperialism really took place. You had a Greek War of Independence, the Industrial Revolution. Italy is unified. Germany is unified. There's the Crimean War, Franco-Prussian War, and again, the rise of imperialism, where nations began to develop colonies so they can develop economic trade. This brings us up to the 1900s, which many of us are extremely familiar with. This is the 20th century, during which we had World War I and the Russian Revolution. Then between World War I and World War II, we had a Great Depression, along with the rise of fascism. And then there's World War II, the Holocaust, the D-Day invasion. And then at the end of the war, we have atomic power. The Cold War begins. And there's this process of decoupling, decolonizing the imperial colonies from their colonies around the world. And then you have other important things that happened in the 20th century are the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the development of the internet, television and advanced telecommunications, the space race, and the rise of China as an economic power. And then that brings us to the 21st century. Key things to keep in mind that are, continuing to develop are the importance of the internet, the rise of liberalism, and the rise of conservatism. We have probably seen the peak of Chinese influence and economic power already in this century. And we're also seeing Europe drifting into chaos. I'll have more on that later. Now, what are the issues that we currently have to look forward to? Well, there's the internet and its impact on our social institutions, the rise of liberal thought and liberalism and conservatism, and also, Egypt, not Egypt, but China, and how's China going to handle the current trade wars, the tariff wars that we're involved in, as well as what's going to happen in Europe because of the rise of Islamic fundamentalism inside the nations of Europe. Are we going to see a revisitation of the conflict between Christians and Muslims inside of European countries, which the Crusades, at least to some degree, stifled and put off, or are we going to see a recurrence of that kind of conflict? It's yet undetermined. So, fundamentally, what I wanted to do is just really walk you through a quick recap of Western civilizational development. And it really can be brought back fundamentally to Western civilization is heavily influenced by ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and the Hebrew people, and the Bible and Christianity. From a conflict perspective, of course, as Rome expanded and brought Christianity throughout the European, area, you had a lot of attacks on Europe coming out of Eastern Europe and Northern Asia, the Mongols, the Russians, the Prussians, all that kind of stuff. But fundamentally, the people of Western Europe are bound together by a common Greek, Roman, and Judeo-Christian set of principles for how civilizations should interact and perform. From a conflict perspective, there's a huge conflict between those fundamental principles of civilizational, sort of foundational glue, and the Islamic world, which has for the last 1400 or so years been growing both either rapidly or gradually in influence, but in direct contradiction in many respects to the foundational thoughts that are responsible for Western civilization, and we see that continuing to this day. I just wanted to sort of lay a foundation here before I get into other topics, because I think it's important to understand the true importance of these root beliefs from a philosophical, religious, and moral perspective for how civilizations should work. And again, they go back to the ancient Hebrew people, Greek, and Roman civilizations, and the core principles that those civilizations developed have grown into the foundational principles for how civilized society should operate in the Western world. I hope this has been interesting and helpful, and I look forward to doing another one on the rise of it. Well, I've got a lot of my plan to do. So thank you for watching.